It's a little slow, isn't it? Hello, good afternoon, and you're very welcome to this afternoon's workshop from the National Concert Hall in Dublin as part of the International Master Course 2021. We hope that you're enjoying the session so far, and as we said earlier today, we would very much love to be doing this in person, but we're delighted that you can join us from wherever you are in Ireland and indeed around the world. Now, we're delighted to have three particularly fine musicians working with us this afternoon, and musicians who cross the boundary from jazz, improvised music, and contemporary classical music. And that is indeed the subject of our workshop this afternoon, creative improvisation in contemporary music. And improvisation is perhaps a word that strikes fear into some hearts, but is also an amazing opportunity and avenue for creativity. And that's what I think we hope to explore this afternoon. We're delighted to welcome Ronan Guilfoyle, Cora Lunny, and Nick Roth. And we apologise, Kate Ellis, who was also supposed to join us, unfortunately is unable to do so for reasons beyond our control. Ronan Guilfoyle is a major figure on the Irish jazz scene and has developed an international reputation as a performer, teacher, and composer. Performing on the acoustic bass guitar since the early 1980s, Ronan is now one of the instrument's leading exponents and is now much in demand as a bassist both in his native Ireland and on the international jazz scene. Cora Lunny is a freelance improvising musician with a strong classical background and extensive experience in contemporary classical, improvised, recorded, and folk musics. As a freelancer, Cora is often to be found playing with Crash Ensemble, and she is also a member of Rodney. Nick Roth is a saxophonist, composer, producer, and educator. His work sees the liberation of improvisation from composition, the poetic syntax of philosophical inquiry, and the function of music as translative epistemology. He is artistic director of the Rodney Ensemble and a founding member of the Water Project. Ronan, Cora, and Nick, you're very welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Nigel.
So, without further ado, I will hand you over to Ronan Guilfoyle, and we hope you enjoy the session. Please do keep an eye on our website, nch.ie, for all of the scheduling of events for the International Master Course. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. So we're going to start by doing the obvious thing, which is to improvise for a little while, and then we'll talk after that. I often think that one of the most challenging things when you're improvising like that is to know the right moment to stop. And I thought that it's a very interesting thing, that kind of sense between a group of people of when a conversation either needs to stop or when the conversation needs to change direction. And maybe I'll just start by saying what we played there. First of all, it's important to understand that we've actually never played as a group together. In fact, we've actually never played together. I've written music for Cora's play, and I've known Nick for a long time, but we've actually never played up to this moment, so world premiere, all that stuff. And it's very interesting in that situation to just start playing and see what happens. And one of the things I think we were talking a little bit before this about what are things that we would really like to get across, and one of them is definitely the absence of fear of what it is that of a fear of being wrong. I guess that's a good way to put it, or a fear of not playing the right things and what those are. And if I could take that back then to the idea of that, to when we started to play, Nick, if I just remember, in 10 more minutes I wouldn't remember these details, so it's good to do them now while my memory is still there. Nick started playing with some kind of breath sounds, and then Cora started playing with kind of long notes. And for me, I just felt that what I would like to do is to kind of be in the center of that somehow, between these two long sounds that were on either side of me. So I started to play those kind of short note things, which are completely the opposite of what's being played on each side of me, which, this kind of whatever I played. It's just so different to what was going on. And I felt that would, that would be a good contribution to make, so that because you would have a sense of that little conversational thing that I was doing with on each side of me in these long notes. And then it went to where it needed to go, is how I put it. After that, it went to where it needed to go. But so what wouldn't have been possible would be for us to have gone to where we'd gone if I'd sat there and thought, if I play short notes now, will they like it, or is that the right thing? Or people who, maybe there's somebody here that I really respect, which is always a scary thing, of course. Maybe they'll think. If you do that, you can't go down. Well, it's impossible to play music of any kind under those circumstances. But with improvising, one of the things that you have to do is to be happy to be yourself and to contribute to a conversation in exactly the same way that you would if you met two people for the first time. It's not the first time we've met, but musically it's the first time we've met. If you met some people for the first time and you might say, oh yeah, and did you, and you start asking some questions and they say something and you go, all right, and did you? And it becomes that kind of thing. And in improvising, that's a huge part of it. It's a conversation, and it has the kind of impulses and the kind of things that happen in verbal conversation. And so one of the most important things, I think anybody would agree, a very good thing if you're conversing with somebody is to have other people who are good listeners as well as good speakers, right? So you need to listen to what other people are saying and then have the courage to say what you think, basically. That's what it is. And so what we did at the beginning here was exactly that. It was a conversation. One of us had to start. And Nick took the bull by the horns by the horn, and started. And that's what you need. How do you start? Well, somebody needs to play something. That's the first thing. Somebody needs to play something, because unless somebody plays something, we've got nothing to talk about. So that was the first part of that. And the other final thing I'll say about this before inviting my colleagues here to say what they think about it, was then if I jump over what we played in the middle and to the ending, it felt to me like it's some of that is, I think, experience, but when we ended, I knew we were going to end there. I just knew, and it was not a surprise at all. In fact, if somebody kept playing, it would have surprised me. And, so you do get a sense for these little things that maybe now's the time to either change the subject or to stop. The courage to stop is also a good thing. I think that's another thing that we can talk about in conversation, where when people are nervous, often they just can't stop. I hope this doesn't make me sound like I'm nervous. They can't stop talking. But that's the thing, is that to overcompensate nervousness by overplaying is another pitfall for this. So that's my initial impressions of what happened when we started to play and when we finished. So perhaps Nick or Cora, you'd like to...
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to what you're saying there, there's already a lot to unpack just in that. The first thing I'd say is that, when Ronan was listening at the beginning and he heard these two kind of sonic textures, he made a conscious decision to play a certain thing. And I think this is one of the myths which need demystifying about improvised music, is that you just make it up. You just play whatever you want. It can be anything. And that actually, I think, is what people are afraid of. And actually, in truth, improvisation is about making decisions based on the evidence around you and your experience and your own aesthetic of what you think is a good thing to do at this point. So in that particular instance, there were these two textural, kind of architectural entities, and that formed a decision-making process that then gave birth to the musical material that Ronan played. He knew that he wanted to be in contrast, and in general, in improvisational language, you're either going to be in imitative gesture, you're adding to a texture, you're increasing it, you're amplifying it, or you're contrasting it. In very kind of broad sweeps, but generally you're either going with something or against it. So Ronan made a decision. We were very much going with each other. It's this breath, the high note. You hear the bow on the hair of the bow on the string. It's a textural thing. Ronan's decision was, I'm going to go against that. And just in making that aesthetic decision, he's narrowed down massively the scope of what he can play. It's like, okay, now I need short pizzicato gestures. Their thing is quite static harmonically, so if I'm contrasting, I need something which is, an atonal structure, moving away from a tonal sense. So, in just making that decision, I'm going to do something different. Straight away, you've established rules that are going to then outline what you can do. And that's really a huge part of it, because everybody's afraid of getting it wrong. But if you've decided what you're going to do, you're actually getting it right. Yeah, you've decided what you're going to do, and you're like, oh, I just did exactly what I thought I was going to do. I'm nailing this. You know? So it's when you don't know what you're doing, actually, that I think you can be afraid of I'm doing the wrong thing, because you don't know what the right thing is. You need to have an idea. And the truth is, it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. And to unpack the second part of that about the conversational aspect is absolutely true. And just as in ordinary conversation, it's not so much about the facts that you've remembered, it's the actual dialogue that's taking place. It's the fun that you have with language and in speaking and so on. And so it's not particularly crucial whether what you're saying is accurate. It's not about it being right or wrong. It's about it being a part of this dance, a part of this conversation. So those are the two things that I thought from that. What do you think?
Yeah, I very much kind of concur with both of you and all of that. And it's interesting because once this kind of choice has been made, when you came in there, the whole, for me, I don't know, for me, my engagement with music tends to be very visual, and kind of tends to be kind of like, I just kind of see all kinds of weird stuff. And like, you're off on a certain voyage then, and it has a certain atmosphere and a certain flavor. And then I find like just listening to the people around you can just give you everything you need. You can just trust yourself and let go and see what will happen and come out, as well as making those conscious choices. Because sometimes things change too fast to think. I mean, for me, the thinking aspect tends to get in the way a little bit more. It's nice to make conscious decisions here and there, but then in the end it has to be about trust. Which, those things all balance each other out, and it becomes that conversational flow. Where, as you said, it doesn't have to be accurate, like it can be funny. or just it's all about the atmosphere in the end, especially with kind of atonal music like this, because there are no rules. So when you can restrict yourself in any way, you can make things a lot easier.
Yeah, and that brings a subject up, that Cora mentioned in atonal music like this. So in other words, there is no fixed pitch, there's no fixed keys, there are no fixed rhythms, there's no fixed anything, in fact. Having said that, there are many different forms of improvisation, and some of these forms are quite structured. And you can make choices as to, if you want to go into certain areas of improvisation, you will have to, it's not that you can't do whatever you want, but you need to understand the dialect. And maybe that's a good way to put it. You maybe need to understand the dialect that people are going to be using within that, or else you find it very difficult to converse with them. So I often think, I was talking about this recently with a friend of mine about the idea of, my main background as a performer is in jazz, and we have in jazz there's a huge repertoire of pieces that everybody knows, and people play these pieces, blues and rhythm changes and standards and all of these kinds of things. And we were talking about what are the, how would you think about that as an improvisation as opposed to, say, playing the way we've just played? And what we kind of came around to was the idea that when you're playing a blues, or when you're playing rhythm changes, you're actually playing classic stories, or you're telling classic stories that everybody knows. Everybody in the room knows these stories, the audience and the other musicians. You need to understand the story, you need to understand the structure of the story, where it starts, where it goes, where it finishes. And you need to allow the other people to contribute to that story. And then the success or failure of how great you are at telling that story is the creativity and all of that stuff. And this is why, if we talk about jazz, you could have someone like John Coltrane or Miles Davis play a blues for the 100,000th time, and it still is fantastic. They're telling a story that's known. In this case, the story is created along with the playing. That would be the major difference between playing in an improvised music in which there is a preset form and improvised music in which there isn't. Not only are the notes in this case improvised, but the story is improvised, because before we start to play the piece, we don't know the story. And we start to explore this story amongst ourselves as we go. So I think that's a nice analogy, because it also brings us back to this idea that Nick was talking about. You can't just play, you can play anything you want, but that's not the point. You know, the point is that you're supposed to be involved in the story, or the conversation, if we want to call it that we create. And hopefully, if, you know, that first piece we played did create a narrative of some kind, you know, in which we were all involved, of which we had no prior knowledge. So, you know, for those of you who are listening, you might say, but you know, can you know, do you not need to know this scale or that scale? It depends, to be honest. It really depends. It depends on what part of the music, you know, what kind of improvising you want to be involved with. And it's not that you has to be one or the other. You can be involved in both, or more than, you know, in myriad kinds of forms of improvisation. But so I think this is, again, to explain a little bit about what we did, is that we created a little story there between the three of us. It started off with an introduction that Nick, and then Cora joined there with that, and then I did what I did, and that we talked about, and then Nick kind of came in with me a little bit, and then gradually the thing moved, and we went from A to B to C to D to whatever we want to call it, and at the end the story was told. That's how I felt about it, and that's kind of a nice way to think about this. You know, tell a story. Allow your friends to join you in telling you the story, or telling the story, or you to join them in telling the story. At different points, somebody may take up the narrative. Somebody steps out front and says, and then this, you know, and the others go. Sometimes you're accompanying, you know, in conversation. A good listener will accompany by kind of stimulating the person who's taken the lead. So they'll say, yeah, really? Wow. And then okay, but what about, you know, and that's a good one too, but what about? Because that's the one where the person who's in suddenly goes, oh yeah, what about that? Maybe, yeah, tell what you, and then they take off. So this language analogy and story analogy is tremendously accurate, I would say, in terms of describing this process. People who have not improvised, tend to think that, I've heard this so many times, oh, you either have it or you don't. But the reality is that every human being improvises every day. We improvise our lives. You get up out of bed in the morning, I presume you don't have a decision as to whether you put your left sock or your right sock on first. Presumably, whichever one comes to hand first, and, you know, I always put the toast on and then I do. I mean, I hope you don't live that kind of life. If you don't, and you live the normal kind of life where you do generally similar things, but it's different each day, you're improvising from the moment you wake up. And it is the most natural thing for people to improvise. And just to go briefly, you know, if you see small children, particularly like around the age of 2 to 3 years of age, and you see them on their own, they're not really aware that you're looking at them. You'll often hear them singing, and what they're singing is actually not a song that is known by anybody except the child doing it. They improvise. They feel good. They're doing something, and you'll hear them, and they'll be. It's a totally natural impulse for human beings to express music through improvisation. And sometimes what happens is, once we become involved in styles, whatever that is, maybe it's classical or jazz or rock or whatever it is, we tend to think, well, that's the way you play music, and therefore the improvisational impulse gets, like any muscle you don't use, it atrophies. So for anybody looking at this who would love to be, you know, able to improvise, all I can say to you is you are able to improvise. You just have to figure out how to get to it, because it's internal in all of us.
It's about getting out of your own way, I find.
Yep.
It's like, that's the main thing. Just whatever you can do to trick yourself to get out of your own way, to stop that stream of thoughts that tells you all the reasons you shouldn't be here right now and shouldn't be playing and someone better could be doing it. Because it's not about that. It's about the experience. It's about the connection with the other people. It's about your own personal enjoyment of the creative moment. Like well, I mean, I'm very process-based when it comes to any music. I don't really think about outcomes so much when I play in general, because I've found that doesn't help so much. I'd rather live in the moment and enjoy that moment, and then it turns out the best because you're relaxed and you're able to respond to what's going on. So anything that you can trick yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation analogy is really good, I think. And, you know, the whole etiquette of conversation also plays a role. You know, if you're having a conversation with someone who just talks all the time and never listens and never stops, like, it's a boring conversation. And exactly the same thing is true musically. Exactly. You have to be able to kind of balance, you know, making an input when it's required, taking the lead when the lead needs to be taken, and sitting back, and, you know, that's when a good conversation happens. You know, exactly the same kind of rules apply.
Exactly.
I mean, another way of thinking about it is that it's spontaneous composition. I mean, this is,
yes.
You have probably heard this phrase, improvisation is spontaneous composition. And that's also a useful way, because that brings in a lot of tools as well, ways of thinking about and building music and creating music. And, you know, when you're improvising, you're doing it in real time. And there's a great story about Steve Lacy. I'm sure you know the story, but Steve Lacy is a great saxophonist, and he was once stopped in the street in New York, and a kind of journalist or somebody asked him and said, "Steve, can you tell me what is the difference between improvisation and composition in 15 seconds?" And he was recording it, and Steve replied and he said, "The difference is, in composition, you have as long as you like to think about what you're going to put into those 15 seconds. In improvisation, you've got 15 seconds. And the guy was recording it, and he took it home and transcribed it. It was exactly 15 seconds. But that's, so, you know, if you write music, and I'm sure a lot of you do write music or have thought about writing music, all of that kind of vocabulary and artillery and, you know, material, grist for the mill, if you will, you can bring into play. You can make these kind of compositional decisions, exactly like Ronan did, of contrasting, and, you know, you can think in terms of architecture, you can think in terms of aesthetics, in terms of visual images, you know, in terms of cooking. Like, there's a million different analogies that you use for this, and all of those different things contain some aspect of composition and improvisation.
Yeah, and another thing that people who have not done so much improvisation often say, but I don't know what to play, I have no ideas, and all this kind of thing. And in that case, you know, this is not so mysterious. You can create parameters for yourself. It's not just, oh, you know, you close your eyes and whatever comes out, which is true, but you can also be methodical about it. You know, you can set yourself parameters upon which you decide I'm going to play something. So for example, you could, what's an obvious thing? Well, rhythm. So maybe what we'll do is I'll set up some kind of rhythmic thing, and then you guys join me in whatever way you feel is appropriate. So the impetus of this particular improvisation is whatever rhythm it is. I have no decisions yet, but whatever, that's where I'm setting up a parameter here, and the parameter in this case is the idea of rhythm, or the idea of pulse and rhythm. There's some kind of generator out there. I don't know if you can hear it. It was really appropriate at that moment. So I just started playing a rhythm, a rhythmic thing. It kind of fell under the fingers as a bass player. It's kind of, it didn't, that kind of thing as a bass player, 5/1, meat and potatoes. I heard a great thing somebody said recently, that this is the upper register, this is the cash register. So this is where you, on a bass, this is where you earn the money. And I heard a drummer say recently, he said to a young drummer, he said, he said, the fills are for the thrills, but the groove pays the bills. That's another good one. So in this case, this fits under the hands well. So the first thing I played was a 5/1, and then I just played that little rhythm, and maybe there's a little bit of harmony involved because I started to hear myself move or started to hear movement, a harmonic movement in a certain direction, which is kind of based loosely on a harmonic progression made famous by John Coltrane called giant steps. This, so like this. So very loosely, but so there was some harmony involved as well for me, and I just started playing, and then I think I played a little pause, and then that seemed to be a nice thing to kind of do, so I kept that going through the piece. So that's all I was doing really, was playing 5/1 movements, that little rhythm, 5/1 movements of my fingers, and then this up a minor third down a fifth movement of the Coltrane thing, and then a little pause. So those are my parameters that eventually arrived once I played the first phrase or the first couple of phrases. So I don't know for you guys, have anything to...
Yeah, I mean, rhythm is definitely the great mover, isn't it? I mean, it's the ultimate kind of commonality in any kind of music, like happening together at the same time. And I think, groove is essentially that repetitive, time-based phase of togetherness. It's a moment where we are temporally and spatially together. And every kind of music has its own kinds of grooves, and these kind of essentially rhythmic or metrical structures. But they're great moments to kind of just check in with everybody. It's like, okay, this in time, and so throwing pulse in, as Ronan did there, is a huge kind of grist for the mill. Suddenly it's like it's establishing a matrix, essentially. It's saying, this is a pulse, which means that at these points, there is going to be either a togetherness, as in we acknowledge that this is the one and we're here, or you're consciously going against it, as we did in some of the breaks where we just kind of kept going. Mm-hmm. But it's establishing a structure that there kind of lays out the map. And the map is not the territory, of course, but it's certainly a way of navigating around in it.
Yeah, it gives you a lot to work off, let's say. There's just so many ways you can play with it. And like what was happening a lot was like we were doing kind of syncopated stuff and a few little triplets thrown in. A lot of the time we kind of hit them at the same time, which was really quite funny. Like that's the sort of thing that you can't really plan, but then it happens and works. Yeah. So that's nice.
Yeah, and one thing to bring this thing with the rhythm and the groove is that if you want to start a group thing, for your first time, you can do a lot worse than by setting up a pulse. Really you can. Because it comes back to a very fundamental part of human nature. It's entrainment, which is called entrainment, which is the ability that humans have to synchronize themselves to an external beat. So this is something, it's a very interesting thing because it's an evolutionary thing, and it's very important for society because it allows you to synchronize things. So this would have probably arisen in work. You still have it, work songs and people working in rhythm. If you see somebody like doing something like passing a bucket chain, when they're trying to put out a fire or something, everyone's doing this. This is entrainment. This is a very, very basic form of entrainment. And what's very interesting about that is that we develop it as we get a little bit older. So again, to go back to the small children are great to watch for these kind of things. A small child will respond to music in a very abandoned way. They dance, they sing, they move around, and all of that stuff. What you notice is a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, they're totally abandoned, but keeping a beat is a little bit of a challenge. But when they start to hit around 4, it starts to kick in. And this has been noticed by evolutionists and anthropologists, is that we evolve this as we get a little bit older. It's called entrainment, of how to synchronize to a fixed point what other people are doing. Now, if you think about that, that's talking about life, and you can see that in army marching, for example, or football chants. Football chants are all based on people, 20,000 people being able to do entrainment, and that they're all together. So if you think about that, well, what better way could there be to set up a little improvisation is by connecting yourselves to a beat, basically, and then playing off that beat. That's a very good way to just start off, and just be really, just as a starting point, because it's something we all understand, because it's part of our human nature, actually, absolute human nature. And in fact, animals can't do entrainment, with the exception apparently of a couple of cockatoos who apparently were able to do it. But other than that, they can't do it. It's a very human thing.
Wow.
Entrainment, where you play to a beat, is a human. It's a function of being human, actually, which is really interesting. That rhythm is so fundamental to us as a species, actually. Did you want to play your? Sorry, Cora.
I was just saying that's fascinating. I didn't know that, but that's
Yeah, it's. I only found that out recently myself, and it was an absolute eye opener, in terms of.
Because this is the thing. People are always saying, "What makes us human? What makes us human?" But maybe music is actually the thing that really.
Well, if you think about it, the first thing every human being has ever heard in the history of humanity is a rhythm. Because when you're in the womb, when eventually the cells coalesce to the point where you can hear, the first thing you hear is a triplet beat, right? It's like do 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 do. So every human being in history, the first thing they ever heard was a rhythm. So there's a very good point to be made, or case to be made, for rhythm maybe encapsulates humanity. Absolutely encapsulates it as a species. It's this thing of rhythm. So it's a very, very fascinating thing. I was going to suggest that the two of you play your little fugue.
Yeah,
How about that?
Okay.
I can try that.
Cool.
So,
I haven't. I'm going to read this for the first time now.
to explain the idea. So, I'm reading a book at the moment called Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid by Douglas Hofstadter. And essentially the book looks at the work of Gödel, who is a mathematician, who famously came up with the incompleteness theorem. And MC Escher, you may know, who did a lot of the drawings that were these kind of paradoxical images, impossible images, and Johann Sebastian Bach. And the book is written from the perspective of kind of computer science and AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning in the 70s, looking at these kind of recursive loops where things can kind of magnify and multiply inside themselves and create these kind of infinite chains. And his kind of macro thesis is this is how consciousness arises, is from these kind of little mini loops expanding outwards. But in the book, there's some really excellent stories about Bach that I didn't know. And one of them talks about the first visit that Bach, or old Bach, as he was called in his lifetime when he was old, visited King Friedrich. And his son, C.P. Bach, was the court Kapellmeister at that time, and was also a famous composer in his own right. But everybody wanted old Bach to come, and he'd never come. And towards the end of his life, he told his son in a letter that he would like to visit the court and visit the king. And the king, Friedrich, was also a musician, played the flute, was a big patron of the arts, had 18 of the first ever pianos made for his palace, and had a piano in every room, and had his own ensembles, played chamber music, and was a kind of a force for the arts. And he was hugely excited that Bach the Elder was going to pay him a visit. So when Bach came, it was a royal banquet, and Bach was the guest of honor, and he took Bach to all of the different rooms to get him to play all of the different pianos. And as a kind of party piece, I guess, Bach said, would your honor, your highness, do me the honor of giving me a theme? And so the king wrote out quite a chromatic theme, actually, and gave it to him. And Bach improvised a four-voice canon, sorry, a four-voice fugue, straight away. And everybody was like, because he'd been given this theme, he didn't know what he was going to get, and he just suddenly created a four-voice fugue from it. And then when he went home, he added an extra 8 voices and wrote an 8-part fugue, and along with a whole suite of music, all dedicated to the king, which included his crab canon, which is a palindromic canon, which can be played reading backwards or forwards, and some of the sonatas are in there as well. And just reading that story, I was kind of like really struck by this idea that the fugue is an improvisational tool. And I remember talking recently to Gwendolyn, whom I'm sure you know, and she was saying, yeah, I mean, I always used to think that improvisation kind of died out in classical music in the 18th and 19th century when people started writing their own cadenzas. But then she said, I read a 17th century treatise by Corelli, and he was saying, where have all the great improvisers gone? Which just kind of really, I think, makes me think that actually improvisation has always been a part of classical music, and it always will be. And it is now, and it was then. And there will always be people going, oh, if only the improvisation hadn't gone. It's like, it has to be alive, because otherwise there'd be no new music. Like, where else does it come from? Somebody at some point makes something up, right? And I always used to think about the fugue as this, kind of arch, complex form, and there's so many rules, and da-da-da. But I'd never actually written one. And then for the kind of final passage of my second quintet, which is for accordion and string quartet, for Dermot Dunn and the Vogler Quartet, I decided, okay, I'll write a fugue for the final thing. So I looked up, how do you write a fugue? What are the rules? And actually, it's very simple. Like, the only thing which is really set in the fugue is that the theme is stated in the tonic, and then the second voice echoes that in the dominant, and then subsequent voices repeat it in the tonic, dominant, tonic, depending on how many voices there are. But in between that, the counterpoint is essentially free. There are no rules that dictate what has to happen other than the entries and the tonic dominant thing. So I was like, well, actually, you could improvise that. Now, that's what we're going to try now. I should state that we've never tried this before. This has never been attempted in the history of humanity.
I have never seen this.
She's never seen this.
In my life.
I wrote this down.
In fact, you've never met before.
In fact, what even is this?
Today, am I?
Is this even on?
No.
I wrote this down literally 2 minutes before the cameras started rolling, so it's not something that we've kind of played. But let's try it. So do you want to play it?
Well, I take the theme in the original key.
You play it in the
Then
tonic.
you can do the transposing.
I will attempt to play it in the dominant.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Can we just play it once in the tonic first, just to make sure that I've...
Together.
Yeah, just so I can... And you can hear it.
Yeah.
Because it's probably the only time you're going to hear it played right by me.
Cool. Go for it. Okay.
I think that's just as an observer, listener, observer, I think that's a good example of people using language that's known. So in this case, kind of relation to Baroque period. And so for those of you who may not have been so familiar with what we played at the very beginning, that probably sounded a bit more familiar to you because Cora and Nick were using, or referring to a story, if we talk about referring to a story that you've heard before, or versions of that story. So that language that they played, even though they were improvising and it was a brand new theme that Nick wrote, had areas of familiarity to people who've heard that kind of story before. So that's kind of a very interesting, I think, illustration of that, of what they played. Had that, if you're listening to that, you might even say, except, well, I guess you wouldn't hear saxophone so much all these days, who knows? But you might say, well, who composed this piece, because sometimes that's a nice thing to do, actually, and it's a nice idea, is to take an element of something that's known and then improvise around that. So, or an element of a type of music. And maybe I could suggest something we could do as the three of us now, is that in jazz there's a thing called a ballad. And a ballad is a slow tune, tunes like Body and Soul, Lover Man, all of these tunes. And we can maybe improvise a ballad. And so what I'm going to suggest, we try and think of that kind of tune, but we've no preset structure or form, but we keep the vibe of the ballad, and I will probably keep the kind of typical bass groove of ballad going, and we see what we come up with. So in this case, we're taking, again, it's a bit like what Cora and Nick just did. We're taking one aspect of known story or known music, which is a jazz ballad, but all the other areas are up for grabs, really. So, and in this case, I'm going to count it in.
All right.
And let's see what the first thing that we hit. the well-known ballad, I didn't know what key it was.
I didn't know where to come in.
Yeah.
But another thing which came up there, and which also I think very much came up in the fugue, is harmony, right? So you do need to know what's going on with the notes. And that's not that, it's not that crazy. Like, there's only 12 notes. I mean,
well, if you have an instrument like mine, you can play a lot more in between.
I mean, there's a larger,
Gives you a lot of scope.
I know. I mean, before we get into microtonal music and nuances, like, okay, there's different colors of each 12 note, but generally speaking, there's 12 notes, and each one of those notes has a different relationship with all the other ones. There's 12 sets of intervals, essentially, and each of those intervals has a color and has a sound. And to be a good improviser, you need a very strong sense of those intervals, and you need to know what they are in real time. And to hear, especially in improvised music where you don't know what the next note is going to be, you need to be able to hear very fast what these two people have just played and what that now means for the next note you're going to play. Because we're all more or less playing single note instrument. I mean, obviously you guys can double, triple, quadruple, but for the most part we're playing one note at a time, right? So we're essentially creating a triadic structure. When we're doing the duo, we're playing dyads, which means that within that information, you need to know that essentially it comes down to this kind of two-part structure again. Is what you're playing consonant or is it dissonant? And if it's dissonant, that narrows it down. It means you're a semitone away from someone else. And that's a lot of information to hear straight away, and that can give you an immense amount of options to just know, I'm hearing dissonance, and quite often, especially at the beginning in improvisation, people are really afraid of the dissonance because that's the wrong note. Someone plays the major 7 chord, and you're coming on the minor third, like that is potentially a clangor. But not if you know, okay, there's a dissonance here, and so I must be on a semitone away from something. If I move a semitone either side, I'm going to create a resolution. And that kind of actually is what makes the music happen. If everything was constant all the time, there would be no tension, there would be no possibility of release. So being able to real-time understand, okay, there is a tension here, and that gives me the options to go this way or that way to create a release, or that I'm creating a kind of a consonant texture by playing unison or playing fifths or playing octaves with somebody, is a real kind of get out of jail free card, just be able to hear real time. So one of the things that I always say to all musicians generally, but particularly if you're improvising, is just really make sure you learn your intervals. You can sing your intervals, you can hear you just know those intervals inside out. And then you can get into the nuances of kind of microtonal systems as well, even better because you have a strong kind of bass in the 12-tone system. What were we talking about?
Well, I think that is a good point. You cannot, I won't say you cannot, but it's very difficult to do anything like what we've been doing unless you actually understand structure, because you're going to have to create structure as you go. And again, to bring it back to the language analogy, it's very hard to have a conversation with anybody if you don't know grammar and you don't know vocabulary, those two things. That's like if you were speaking with Russian people and you don't know any Russian, you may be able to communicate after a fashion, but it's going to be quite limited in how much you can communicate together in terms of, at least in language. So knowing about harmony, knowing about rhythm, knowing about melody, knowing about how to play your instrument to have a certain facility. These are all important. It's not a question of that anybody can pick up any instrument and just play, anything they want and that'll work. That could work if you're particularly brilliant and you're on your own. But as soon as other people come into the mix, then you do need to have a kind of common understanding of certain basics of musical language, which would be intervals, harmony, rhythm, and the techniques of your instrument. And preferably, probably played a few songs from time to time. Probably wouldn't hurt. I'm conscious that both Nick and I have started off stuff. Cora, would you like to lead us in
Sure.
something?
Sure. Right. Shall we place any restrictions on this, or will we just play?
It's up to you. Whatever
Goodness.
whatever you
Okay.
whatever you feel.
Oh, let's just play then.
Okay.
I'm just better at playing about music than talking about it anyway.
Yeah.
So that was a two-part opus.
Yeah. So no, there was an obvious moment there where it's like we could have stopped, and that's that thing you're talking about. But sometimes it's good to push on as well.
Big time.
And be like, because also, I mean, one of the things that I would look for in improvisation is like trying to break habits as well. It's like once you start getting into, so we got into a rhythm of basically playing kind of 260-second pieces. Where everything was like around 2-3 minutes, and then we'd stop, and that starts to become a pattern.
Exactly.
And quite often, the real gold, the really good stuff, is to be found when you break a pattern, when you identify, okay, well, we're usually stopping here, so if we just kind of keep going, maybe we'll get into. And that was where suddenly the vocabulary totally changed, and people started doing things they hadn't done before.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I kind of see it like mining.
But it's also keeping your mind in the right place, because you want it to be unpredictable. If you don't, like, the whole point of playing this music is to play something that hasn't already been played. Well, one of the points, but yeah.
Yeah, and
that's hard to do. Because
and it's unique to the three of us right here, right now.
Exactly.
That's one of the difficulties that sometimes people have with improvised music, is the fact that most music that we hear is the result of a process, so it's result driven. So compositions, in other words, compositions are the result of a certain pattern work, and then the piece is usually fixed. Paintings are a result of the same process. Most art actually, or most traditional art anyway, theatre, books, plays, books, theatre, composition, is result based art. So improvisation is process-based art in the sense that it exists while it is happening, and when it is finished, it is finished.
It's ephemeral.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, but some people find that difficult, because when you come to listen to improvised music, you're actually coming to be part of the evolution of something. Whereas with most music, you are going. Most of the time anyway, you kind of know what's going to happen. I don't mean that in a bad way, but because that can be a great thing too. If you're going to hear great work of musical composition, there's nothing better than knowing it's great and then going and getting the full effect of a live performance.
It's fantastic.
But it's a different thing with this, and I mean, I think it was Eric Jolffe said, we play something and then it goes out in the air and is never heard again, which was a very, very kind of profound thing to say at the time he said it. And so what we did there, it was a process, and that's what you should be aiming for when you try this with your friends or with your colleagues, is to produce something that is unique to you on that day, at that time, with all its warts and inconsistencies and all of those things. That's who we were at that moment. And it's the same thing. I always think it's again, to go back to the conversational analogy, if two or three of you are having a conversation and you recorded the conversation and then listen back to it the next day in the cold light of day, you'd probably be horrified at the grammatical mistakes.
Exactly.
Oh, I keep saying the same thing over.
Exactly. Oh my God, I say like all the time.
Yeah, like quirks and little things that we do.
But those things are actually nice. When you hear your friend back and you hear their particular method and pattern of speech, all those things endear you to them.
Yeah.
And it's the same with music.
Exactly. And the corollary of that is, in a composition, is reading a speech, actually, or like actors in a play. They're reading a script, or they're learning a script and they're saying that script. So it's the difference between the spontaneity of group storytelling and the performance of a story. We'll go back to the story analogy again, a story that has been written for a specific effect, and hopefully the composer of that story has interpreters and actors, or whatever you want to call them, who will be good enough and believe enough in that story to bring it out. The great thing about, if you're watching a great classical musician or a great player of any kind who's playing composed music, is they make you believe they wrote it.
Exactly. It has that feel of being as fresh as the day it was composed.
And that's brilliant. That's like actors. I mean, somebody doing Macbeth, it's just 400 years old at this point. You think, well, how possibly can they bring that back to life? But they do every time if they're really good. Now you might say, well, I couldn't speak anything that's as good as Macbeth. Well, does that mean you can never speak? It's like, you speak. It's profound because you're with your you're with people, hopefully maybe you love or certainly respect and certainly are friendly with, and you create something between you that's unique to you.
Yeah, and I think the group thing is really important as well, and playing with the same people a lot is hugely important. I mean, like, so we haven't played together before, but I study with Ronan, so we have a kind of a shared vocabulary in there because I learned from you. But we have played hundreds of
so many.
So there is a kind of a shared thing that you can just go to, and there's kind of this well that you can draw on of common references and shared language. And I remember talking to Mick O'Shea in Cork, who, along with Danny McCarthy, have the Quiet Club, who I think make some of the best improvised music in the country. And he said they were doing it for 20 years in Cork before they looked up and saw an audience.
That's beautiful.
And now they're at the center of this like really important sound art scene, and they play all over the world, but like they were doing it the whole time, and and they have this incredible relationship. I mean, they've been probably playing together for 40 years now, and they have this unbelievable kind of like no theater thing where the no performer, they're not even watching what's happening on stage, but they drop a cymbal and it's the exact moment someone on stage drops a cymbal. And it's like, how did that? And Mick and Danny have this same kind of incredible synchronicity and synergy that they'll just be like not even looking at each other and just almost seems like they're completely just doing their own thing, and then suddenly bang, something happens at exactly the same moment. It's like, how did that happen? And I remember asking them, like, how do you guys rehearse? And he's like, very early on at the very beginning, we made an agreement to never, ever talk about what we've just done.
Oh, that's beautiful. That is beautiful.
Never. They never, ever spoke about any gig or anything they've ever done. And but they've been doing it for 40 years. And just as you're saying, it's a process.
Yeah.
That process doesn't begin and end when you're playing. It's a 40 years.
But it's also it's the relationship between the people. And this is like all around the music playing time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I will say something that I immediately was aware of when we started to play was that you guys have played together a lot. I know that, but I could actually feel that you guys are. So that actually, to be honest, that makes it very easy for me, because I feel that there's a thing, let's call it a thing, which is your thing, that I can plug into. That basically is there for me to become part of. It's an interesting. This happened to me in Greece a couple of years ago, where I played these improvisers, completely free improvisers from Crete, and we've started playing a lot together in the last 3 or 4 years. But the first time I played with them, I'd never played with them before, and I didn't. It's kind of a long story, but I wasn't really sure what was going to go on. And they started playing, and they had this unbelievable, because they've been playing for 10 years. It was unbelievable how strong this thing was, and I thought, this is just great because I can just plug into it. And I definitely felt that in the improvising today. We never played as a trio, none of us, but I mean, it's not me saying, oh, they sound like, it's just a sensation of that there's a thing going on here that I can play with. So that was kind of interesting, from my point of view.
So I think it's if you're getting into improvisation, it's really about play the long game. Find some people that you love playing with, and just keep doing it, And it's not like the first time you play is going to be unbelievable. You just keep doing it, and after a decade, you'll have a thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing is for me, improvising was very unpleasant in the beginning because I was very self-conscious, because I came from that whole classical thing as well. I never came through jazz or anything like that. So trying to improvise was terrifying and painful. So it wasn't very nice, but then once I finally did it enough that I could get to the point where I could switch off while doing it, it started to become actually fun. So, I mean, I knew it would eventually, but it took a bit of work to get there. I mean, sounding good is another thing entirely. It took much longer to actually sound any useful, but
yeah, we don't have enough time for what it means to sound good. By the way, anyway, so I wasn't checking my emails on this. This is this pedal here, which has different sounds, which is kind of useful sometimes. In this case. So it can be controlled from the Bluetooth, so I just changed a couple of sounds there. So just in case you thought I was checking my Facebook page. Having a great time
what else
playing
you got
with the guys,
there?
Yeah. So I guess the National Concert Hall clock there, we're getting close. Will we play a little piece to finish up?
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
be great.
Very appropriate, I think. So thank you, everybody who's tuned in, and thank you to the National Concert Hall, and to Nigel and everybody in the Education Department, and the hall in general. And from my point of view, thank you, Nick. And
Thanks for
Cora.
having
It's
us.
really,
Thank you.
really fun. And yeah, let's put our money where our mouth is. Play some music.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy your improvisational lifetimes.